You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. My name is Brendan Cole. This is Telling It Like It Is, our weekly look at the stories making the headlines. With me in the studio is Brooks Newmark, Conservative MP for Braintree and Essex. Also here is Alexander Nekrassov, the former Kremlin advisor. The NSPCC's head will chair a review into what happened into claims of a Westminster paedophile ring in the 1980s. An independent panel will examine how public institutions have responded to sex abuse allegations generally. Brooks, what kind of impact does this have on Westminster? I mean, what kind of atmosphere? Is there a feeling that this could cause a new wave of disenchantment with politicians?
I don't really think so, because a lot of this goes back at least 30 years. And I think, I think people are sort of focused on what's going on now, but it's like all things. It's sort of one thing follows the next. So it's just another, I guess, negative tick the box in the public's mind about politics, politicians protecting themselves, protecting each other. And it certainly doesn't help. But, when I'm on the streets in Braintree, is this something that people have been raising with me? The answer is no.
I suppose, Alexander, there is concern over the judge or the retired judge appointed to chair the review. This is Elizabeth Butler-Sloss. She was chosen by the Home Secretary, and Labour's Simon Danczuk said her position was tainted because her late brother, that's Sir Michael Havers, was Attorney General in the 1980s. I mean, do you see this as a conflict of interest, perhaps?
Well, she is 81, so not exactly a spring chicken. I think it's a bad choice. I think David Cameron is making mistakes here. It's like the Leveson inquiry all over again, which basically backfired on the government itself. Because you have to really respond to the events in a way that people would not start accusing you at once that you're trying to cover up something. And the public out there is actually not very interested in what happened in the 1980s. And 70s. It's more interested in what's going on now. I think this scandal will not go away quickly. What I think also is that people are saying now that this is like the expenses scandal, that this is going to tarnish the image of Parliament. I think, and I always said that in the past, the expenses scandal was a setup. It was a setup because at the time of the banking crisis, Parliament was neutralized by some hacks who needed Parliament to be distracted by something else, because that's when the bankers needed to be taken on by Parliament. And I actually think that if people look very hard back at that scandal, they should realize it was not as clear-cut as it looked. And I think it didn't actually damage Parliament much. It damaged the media, the banking world and its connection to the media, and so on. But this time round, this scandal, that can damage Parliament seriously.
But I suppose the danger is that this could roll on and on and on. I mean, the nature of these kinds of inquiries is that they take a very long time.
Yeah, I mean, I think, so it sort of sits there as a running sore, but I think I sort of put it in the Jimmy Savile, Rolf Harris box of people that behaved badly in the past. I think people looking back at that, I don't think they're necessarily looking at politicians today and tainting what went on 30 years ago with what went on today, other than it's just, as I said, reminds people, following the expenses scandal and so on, there's something we don't particularly like about politicians or Westminster, or they all look after themselves, or they feather their nests. It sort of fits within that sort of narrative about politicians, which, of course, I would disagree with.
Harriet Harman, Labour's deputy leader, launched an attack on Gordon Brown, and she believes that he didn't appoint her to the role of deputy prime minister because she's a woman. Now, Brooks, I know you're co-founder and co-chairman of Women to Win. You want to see more conservative women in Parliament. Does she have a point? Is Parliament sexist, or is she talking about one specific man who she views as sexist?
She's the person who's led the initiative to all women shortlists. She's the one who, has been perhaps more for positive discrimination than pretty much anybody in Parliament. Is there latent sexism in Parliament, as in all professions? Probably yes. Is it as bad as it was when I first went into politics 10 years ago? The answer is no. Is it as bad in business as when I first went in 25 years ago? The answer is no. So I think there's certainly a new generation of people who are used to working in environments where, let's say roughly in my professional life, In the city, there were roughly a third of women in most meetings who were lawyers, bankers, accountants, and so on. I don't see it as much now. Is it still there? The answer is yes, though.
Everybody was screaming their heads off in delight. Oh, Tony Blair brought a lot of women to Parliament. And it all ended in failure. Many of these women were just selected simply because they were women to tick in the boxes and of political correctness. I think people should be judged on merit. There's no point in looking for those quotas. It happened in the Soviet times, Brooks, by the way, when we had quotas for this nationality, for women, and it's never worked because it doesn't work. You have to have people on merit.
So you're saying that all the people who are there surrounding Putin are all there on merit then?
No, it's got nothing to do with that one. We're
No,
talking
of course,
about.
money.
There's a lot of women now, by the way. There's so many women now in the cabinet, in the Kremlin, in the news, in the media, in business in Russia.
But that's good.
And
think about it.
Yes, but it's the same.
of the hold on,
But it's
Alexander.
the same thing, Brooks. It's the same thing.
50% of the population is women. Women are equally as bright as men. They bring a different perspective, a different narrative to legislation and everything. So, well, certainly, I don't know what goes on in Russia, Alexander, but I can say certainly with the Conservative Party, we sort of looked at what went on with the Labour Party and we said, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to, as you said, we want people there on merit. But what we want to make sure is that, we give everybody an equal chance.
High-level political delegation, or at least diplomatic delegation in India this week. Interesting that although only 10 leading British and foreign statesmen have been accorded the honour of a statue on Parliament Square, by next summer they'll be joined by Mahatma Gandhi. Do you think this is some kind of charm offensive between the UK and India? What do you think about what's going on?
Mahatma Gandhi is not just a national icon in India. He's a national icon globally. There are a huge amount of people around the world that have huge admiration for him. So I certainly think it's a good thing. There are a lot of worthy people who could go there, but if we're going to choose somebody like Mahatma Gandhi, I'd certainly be supportive of that.
Although there already is a statue of him in London, Alexander.
In this particular occasion, I think the British government is just trying to do this charm offensive, as you mentioned, because India is an important country. And actually, I think Britain should be doing more to improve relations with Russia as well, because these are the emerging powers, and China as well. And there's no point, for example, for Britain to put another John Kennedy monument, because America is going down. This is a former superpower that's trying to drive a wedge between Europe and Russia through Ukraine, the crisis in Ukraine, with one aim only, to take over the European markets. So I think, yes, it's a good thing for Britain to develop links with India. Britain should be looking at countries who are replacing America, rather than, sticking to this old so-called special relationship, which is not special.
Our passengers flying into or out of the UK have been advised to ensure electronic devices and hand luggage are sufficiently charged to be switched on.
And not forgetting their strip search now and all the other inconveniences.
OK, so when Patrick McLaughlin, the Transport Secretary, says the country faced a constantly evolving threat from terrorism, you don't believe him? You think that this is over the top?
I just find it bizarre that with the moment, Homeland Security in America says, you guys, you search everyone because we have an unspecified threat of terrorism, having armed some of these guys, by the way, in Libya and Syria, who are now back in Europe.
People don't really understand why they have to have a fully charged phone when they arrive at the airport, and I don't know if that's been explained to them, Brooks. What do you think?
Yeah, I have no idea either. I would have thought getting your battery uncharged would be more logical, because anything that could send an electronic pulse or anything like a battery, you would say, well, maybe you shouldn't have that. Having it fully charged, I certainly don't understand. Going back to Alexander's point, though, I do think it's important that if we're told to do things at airports, that there is more transparency and that people understand why they're having to do it. People have a choice. Do they want to fly to America or not? If they don't like the strict security requirements, they don't need to fly to America. They have that choice.
This is not the first time they're saying there's a security threat. And the whole worldwide community needs to follow
Alexander,
it.
you sort of want them to sort of, Americans or the British or whoever intelligence service, to sort of open up the kimono and say, well, we've heard this through this way. This is exactly what's going to happen. Therefore, we are doing the following. At the end of the day, certainly I would, we have to put a certain level of trust and we need a certain level of discretion from our security services that when they do say there is a threat, and I'm not talking about the Tony Blair, we're going to be bombed by Iraq in 45 minutes security
yes,
threat.
but we still remember that.
I'm talking about a sort of proper security intelligence that gets to us. You can't be totally open and say, this is where we heard things, this is what we believe is going to happen. If the security services say there is a threat, we need to respond to that. Because just a second, because if one of these people get through and something bad happens, a plane is blown up, then there'll be all hell to pay.
Staying with threats, two childhood friends who spent 8 months fighting in Syria are facing jail terms. Their families told police they had joined a jihadist group. Brooks, I mean, you were on Channel 4 News last week and you were in a discussion on jihadis and you heard from there in the studio that the goal of the jihadis in Syria was to overthrow Bashar al-Assad, which actually chimes with British foreign policy. Do you see that those who do come back here, the families of those need to really address that? Do you see it as something that the mosques need to address or the authorities?
It should all start in the community, in my view. I do think that the big problem, and this is what I said, and I dealt with Dr. Khan's family just before Christmas when he went over, he was a medic, he went over to help some of the jihadis who were fighting. He then got picked up by the Assad regime, beaten up severely, locked up for something like 8 months. His family came to the Foreign Office and said, hey, can you get him out of jail? It's very difficult. And so my first piece of advice to anybody thinking about going out there is if you get caught, it's going to be difficult for your family then to come to the British government and say, please get us out of jail. So my warning is that you're sort of on your own if you go out there. Number two, if you do go there and you come back, there is a reasonable probability that some of these people will have been radicalized. And if they've been radicalized, they're a threat to the British people. Therefore, I think everybody who comes back here needs to have an interview without coffee by the security services so we can figure out what's gone on, what they've done, and if they are a threat to the British population.
And they want to see an end to Assad, which is what the British government wants to
Well, that's why the problem for
well.
the British government is, because on the one hand they're saying, no, you can't get radicalized. On the other hand, these radicalized young men say, excuse me, but you yourself are saying you want Assad to be out.
Yeah, but you're conflating two things. One is a desire to get rid of Assad, who is butchered something like 150,000, gassed 150,000 of his own people.
Brooks.
The fact is that we do want to get rid of him, and that the vast majority of Sunnis there, who are moderate Sunnis, the 15 million plus, want nothing to do with the extremists. And the extremists number some, let's say, 15,000 people tops in Syria. There's Jabhat al-Nusra, which has 7,000 to 8,000, and there's ISIS that have 7,000 to 8,000 people. And the majority of those radical fighters are foreigners. They're not Syrians. So the majority of Syrians actually want to get rid of him. They're not lunatic Salafists or anything like that who are going to do bad things. But no one's supporting them. No one is supporting the Free Syria Army today. And that is the problem. So I have argued constantly we need to do more to support the moderate majority through the Free Syria Army and the Syrian National Coalition. If we don't, more and more of these people will join the extremists because they're the only people getting the arms and the money to fight Assad.
Unfortunately, your scenario doesn't work. You know why? Because if we didn't have Iraq...
This is according to you.
If we didn't have Iraq or Libya, where you guys, along with the Americans, have removed the regimes and now it's hell, where Libya now is supplying arms to the jihadists all over the Middle East, Libya is a clear example of Western failure to look further than just the regime change, because that nobody understood what's going to happen when he's out. You have failed miserably, when I say you, I mean NATO and America, in Afghanistan, where the Taliban will be back with a vengeance, where the new terrorist camps will be built as soon as NATO troops heroically disengage from Afghanistan. They'll have to fight the way out from some places. I don't think after these examples you can tell us how to do things in Syria. And Russia does not want Assad. Russia wants to have some sort of stability there, because if Syria explodes, then Israel...
If it explodes, it's exploded.
No. When it becomes like Libya, then
it's already there.
Israel,
what do you mean it's there?
Israel will be in greater danger than ever before. And if you destabilize Syria just like NATO destabilized Libya and Iraq, basically, what will happen is we'll have an all-out war in the Middle East, a big one, because everybody will be sucked in there. And when we see ISIS creating their caliphate there, and this is basically a threat to everybody, and the West as well, by the way. These madmen, Baghdadi had this unfortunate sermon where he said, you are with us now, and what we're going to tell you now, you're going to do it now. So all the Westerners are now our enemies, so let's unite and hit them. This is the result of Bush and Blair invasion. This is the result of Western stupidity.
All right, but on the ISIS point, ISIS rebels have apparently taken control of a disused chemical weapons factory. This is according to Iraqi officials, although there is assurances that the munitions have been degraded. I guess it goes to the point of what Nouri al-Maliki, the Shia prime minister in Iraq, will do, because he's refusing to back down, and basically the UK will have to accept him.
I have been arguing that, and I was out in Baghdad about 7 weeks ago, during the elections, and and I met with some of the tribal leaders from Anbar province, and they absolutely hate Maliki so much that they said, we would rather do it effectively. They said we'd rather do a deal with the devil, i.e. ISIS, than have one more day of Maliki. And until everybody understands that Maliki is part of the problem, not part of the solution, the chaos will continue in Iraq. So the first thing, if the West and Iran, because Iran doesn't want chaos on its doorstep, and Russia, if it wishes to be helpful, is to get the message to Maliki, you are part of the problem, not part of the solution. And they need to find an alternative leader there who can try and bring people together, because then, at that point, you can then peel off a lot of the more moderate Sunnis from ISIS. And once you start splitting ISIS, you can then start to make some progress.
A strengthening case for an independent Kurdistan, that seems to be gathering pace, Alexander.
Well, that was expected a long time ago, and once Saddam was out, it was just a matter of time before Iraq disintegrates into three parts.
What's Russia doing now?
Well, Russia's contribution at the moment is trying to help the government to stop ISIS, advancing on Baghdad and taking it over, because the Americans have not supplied the weaponry.
So it is providing material for that.
It's providing the jet fighters, and the Iranians are providing training and so on. The Americans just provided those drones, which are protecting their advisors on the ground, who are supposedly training the troops, who have left their positions at once the moment ISIS fighters appeared. So this is a total mess. All of it done is by the Americans. The Americans should not have withdrawn from Iraq, and Brooks might argue with me, but they should not have withdrawn from Iraq.
I'm not going to argue anything. We were in, after the Second World War, we were in Germany for half a century or more, because we were worried about you guys. We were worried about the Russians coming back again. So to me, while there's been a lot of public pressure, obviously, to pull out from Afghanistan, from Iraq, there is a mess there. The local national militias are not strong enough to do the work, and they need to be support and advice. And to me, I certainly would have had a stronger presence, although not having ordinary soldiers sitting there as target practice for the Taliban or ISIS. But certainly, I would want a presence there to try and give more training, more support to both the Afghan army and to the Iraqi army, both who need more training and more support and more time. There's this book on Afghanistan called Butcher and Bolt. You can't sort of nip in there and then sort of get out after you've created a whole mess. And, I think in both the case of Iraq and Afghanistan, I would have wanted to see a longer-term presence, although, as I said, not with our soldiers, on the ground.
The British had nothing to do. They had no mission there.
In terms of Afghanistan, though, Brooks, I suppose the invasion and exit was based on the prospect of leaving Afghanistan politically stable, and that's on the brink of political collapse.
Well, the mistake that we made, though, was that, our objective, which we did achieve, was to get Al-Qaeda out, the sort of 20,000-ish Arabs who had hijacked Afghanistan through the Taliban. The Taliban have an expression called as "we don't wear watches." And what they mean by that is the Americans and the British, they're looking at their watches, when are we going to be leaving? The Taliban live there forever. You go to the border between Pakistan and Afghanistan, they live there with their families. And so I certainly am somebody, and Alexander knows this, for engagement much more. We should have done much more rather than simply fighting the Taliban the whole time, to try and engage with them. They don't act as a unit. They're lots of different groups with various agendas. And while now and then we seem to have begun to make an effort to engage with the Taliban, I think as a longer-term strategy, we didn't do enough.
let's face it, your troops and NATO troops have allowed the drug trade to blossom in Afghanistan. And do you know that the proceeds of this drug trade are used to fund terrorism? That the Taliban use that money to buy arms? That the Pakistani Taliban are armed with that money as well? So I think it was a total disaster on the part of NATO. I think the whole policy of supposedly establishing democracy in Afghanistan was crazy.
With this disputed elections with Abdullah,
Well, that's
Abdullah
again
not
a proof.
he's not accepting the preliminary results, and Ashraf Ghani, according to preliminary results, got 57% of the ballot. Aside from the Taliban factions and the invasion and so on, what about just getting an election up and running and functioning?
But you could say that, but we can look at, that's the whole argument Maliki makes today, is that they did have a democratic election of sorts, which one could argue was perhaps less dysfunctional than Afghanistan. And we're still in the West saying, but, we don't like the outcome. We don't like that Maliki is there because, while he may have the support of the majority of his own side and as the largest grouping, he himself becomes prime minister. The fact is that, he is causing a lot of problems with all the other groups there. So I don't think having a slightly more perfect democratic election is necessarily the solution.
We were talking about Israel briefly before, but it seems like troops are massing on the Gaza border, Alexander, an escalation in tension after the death of the 3 Israeli teenagers.
It's a mess, complete mess. I blame the Americans all the time for this because they started that silly peace process of theirs that actually inflamed tension there. And I think there's no pressure at all. There is no pressure on the Palestinian leadership. The UN is sending millions and hundreds of millions of dollars to the Palestinian leadership, which is now feeling comfortable there. They don't really need any solution. And this is a crisis that is dragging on. And it's amazing. And I think this is going to turn into a huge conflict now because everybody's preoccupied with their own problems. The quartet, they're all sort of everywhere else. The European Union doesn't even have a leadership at the moment. America is just saying lazily, guys, don't do this. Russia has Ukraine crisis. Nobody's paying much attention.
Well, people will be paying attention if there is a third intifada, though.
Yes, no, I think once again what's going on in Gaza is a tragedy. I think, I understand why Israel is responding the way they are, not necessarily just on the kidnap and murder of the 3 boys, more importantly on the, or equally importantly rather, the continual bombing that it gets. If you've got a piece of land next to you that's controlled by Hamas, and they've sort of created their own state in Gaza, separate from the West Bank, that they say that they control, and there are rockets coming every day into Israel from there, the Israelis just can't sit back and do nothing. They have a responsibility to their citizens, and therefore they need to do something. What is proportionate? Again, I'm not going to be Solomon here, but I will say that if there is a plot of land and a people who created their own semi-country, as I said, in Gaza, where they're continually shelling your own country, you are going to respond.
There is no debate about it. Israel is obviously responding to attacks, but the Palestinians are saying that Israel has destroyed that peace process by building more settlements. They were torpedoing the peace process on purpose.
And I'm someone who opposes the settlements as a provocation to the Palestinians.
So there you have it. So it's an endless cycle.
I agree. Well, the problem is, as you just said about a few minutes ago, is that everybody is distracted by everything else going on in the world.
Well, that's the situation,
the Middle East peace
unfortunately.
process has sort of been pushed on the back burner, and Israel, from its standpoint, is moved. I mean, they fear themselves that there's sort of chaos on their borders when, a few years ago there was relative peace.
Exactly.
So
there was relative
so
peace.
It's not surprising that Israel is reluctant to engage
so
in a peace process.
technically creates problems for Israel.
Well,
because
you've got to stop necessarily keep blaming the Americans. Otherwise, I'll start blaming the Russians for everything. And I'm trying to be a little bit balanced. I'm trying to be a little more balanced. Other than your illegal invasion of Ukraine and the fact that it's a kleptocracy that runs Russia today.
I can tell you something, Brooks. If there were Russian troops in Ukraine.
There were Russian troops in Ukraine. What do you mean?
Listen.
There were.
Let me finish.
Crimea, the last I heard, was part of
the Ukrainian
Ukraine.
troops by now would be in Kiev defending it. So let's forget about that. But the point here is this, that America has not been doing a proper process, a sort of peace process, formulating. Reason why? Because the leadership of the Palestinians and the Israeli leadership are not fit for it.
Okay, well, look, let's move on to the European Union. And interesting comments by Jean-Claude Juncker. He's insisted he will not seek to block British efforts to claw back powers from Brussels. This is despite David Cameron's failed bid to prevent him from becoming president of the European Commission. Brooks, is this reassuring, what he says?
Juncker is so much part of the whole bureaucracy, as I would call it. Frankly, his words become meaningless because, his agenda is for ever closer political and economic union. It's the concerns that we have here in this country is the ever closer political union, certainly ever closer fiscal union. I mean, he is someone who believes in ever closer union within the European Union. We in Britain need to decide, do we want to be part of that project or not? We have promised a referendum. Should we win the next election in 2015 for a referendum in 2017?
You will win the next election, Brooks. I can assure you that.
That's good to hear, Alexander.
Because the media is fully on your side, all of it.
Well, let's hope so. But I think having Juncker there, I was for Juncker. Fun enough, I was for Juncker going in because I'd rather have someone who calls a spade be there, and he represents to me all that is wrong with Europe. So I'm actually glad that he's the top guy there, so we can. We have a clear choice in 2017, and certainly it's going to take a lot to convince me not to vote for us to get out.
So when David Cameron came back, although some would say that he expended a lot of political capital in making sure that he didn't become president, this went down pretty well among your party.
It went down well on the public as a whole. I mean, we went up through, I think, 3 or 4 points in the polls. I mean, David Cameron is there. I mean, people should not forget this. He's there to represent the interests of Britain and the British people, not the Europeans and not big business. And I think he did just a second. He did the absolute right thing to sort of say that Juncker was not acceptable to us. He was not the man that we could really engage with and have a sensible negotiation, because you're negotiating with a guy who has a very different belief system than we have. We want really a free trade relationship with Europe, and really not much more. And we do certainly want to claw back a lot of political powers there.
Well, there's no chance you can claw any political powers from Europe because it's run by Germany. First of all, by the way, Germany, as you know, 171 in Brazil, and I think we are letting Germans, really to get all nationalistic, which is very dangerous. But you know what, the people on the street, because Brooks, you really need to talk on the people on the street.
I do. Britain. I was there this morning,
and they think that the European Union is run by Germany. So that doesn't really matter who sits in Brussels.
Well, the most important thing to people here is that it doesn't matter who it's run by. The fact is it's not run by us. And
of course it's not.
We want control over our own legislation, our own powers, and we want to bring power back to Parliament so that when people vote for their politicians, they know what they're getting. There's no point in voting for us in Westminster and 80% of our legislation coming out of the European Union.
But there's nothing you can do about it.
There is. Hopefully we'll have a referendum in 2017, and with a bit of luck, we'll get out.
Now, the Tour de France, it went through your constituency,
It
Brooks.
did, yes.
Do you think you'd like to see it happen again? Another year, perhaps?
It was great.
Was it a success?
It was absolutely a success. I think, it certainly brings the community together. People get out on the streets. They feel good about themselves. And people, had a good time. What's also interesting is that Britain, really from nowhere, has become a nation of cyclists. We've seen in the Olympics. In the Olympics, we've been doing very well. We find even in London today with people using Boris bikes.
Yes, I hate them.
I'm sure you do.
Yes.
But I think I think that cycling has captured the public's imagination. I think bringing it over to the UK, the first leg of it, certainly is a good thing. As I said, Finchingfield and I was in Rain, which is at the bottom end of my patch. But certainly looking at the crowds in Finchingfield as well, it was amazing turnout from the public.
I think that the Tour de France is a monumental waste of time. Then we will have scandals. Obviously, somebody would be on dope or performance-enhancing drugs. We know this.
Well, we've already had that with other people, but hopefully the tests are strong enough now that won't happen.
And this whole cycling mentality has to be fought and resisted because, in London it's hell now. With all these cyclists, drivers are, complaining. They are creating dangers for public transport, for buses. They are aggressive. Boris made a huge mistake. These huge sporting events, this so-called legacy for, 12 billion was wasted on London Olympics. There is no legacy, Brooks. None. The less people are into
What about
sports,
all the stadiums? What about all the infrastructure?
Idle, the East End is still not the best part of London as it was before that.
I think,
absolutely
Alexander,
worthless.
you have to get out of your little bubble now then. I think the East End is thriving. I think the redevelopment in the area where the Olympic Park is fantastic. I think I would love to get the Olympics here again as soon as possible. I'm all for it. If for any reason the Brazilians can't pull it off in a couple of years, we've got everything here and ready and waiting to hold another Olympics.
I hope Brazilians dump the Olympics, by the way. I was suggesting to them, but...
Well, there was a rumour, funnily enough, that they were going to. I mean, there was a rumour that, are they going to be ready for it in a couple of years? And I've been pushing them to people to come back to
Because, the Brazilians, unlike
plan.
the British, they had the guts to stand up and say to their government, why are you wasting all these billions when we have problems with public transport, with education, with national health? Sounds close to home, doesn't it, Brooks?
Yeah, but at the end of the day, after the Olympics, though, most people here thought it was a good thing.
Well, after losing 7-1, I think they've got enough on their plate. So let's leave the poor Brazilians. That was Telling It Like It Is. Our look at the stories making the headlines, as discussed by Brooks Newmark, the Conservative MP for Braintree and Essex, and Alexander Nekrassov, the former Kremlin advisor. My name is Brendan Cole.